Thomas hadn't slept through the night in 3 years. Not once. Not a single uninterrupted stretch of rest that normal people took for granted. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows shift across the walls as cars passed by outside. His mind would race from one worry to another, like a hamster on a wheel that never stopped spinning. He was 42 years old, a history professor at a university in Washington. His life looked fine from the outside. He had a decent job, a small apartment near campus, and students who mostly showed up to his lectures about medieval Europe. But inside, everything felt like it was falling apart. The insomnia had started during his divorce, long bitter nights lying alone in a new apartment, replaying conversations, wondering where everything went wrong. But even after the divorce papers were signed and his ex-wife moved across the country, the sleeplessness stayed. It was like his brain had forgotten how to shut off. Then came the anxiety about work. The university was cutting programs. Enrollment in history courses was dropping every semester. Thomas watched younger professors scramble for tenure, publishing papers and networking at conferences, while he could barely focus long enough to grade a stack of essays. His hands would shake from exhaustion. His coffee intake had tripled. He'd zone out during faculty meetings only to snap back and realize someone had asked him a question. His doctor tried to help. First came the basic sleep advice: no screens before bed, keep the room cool and dark, exercise during the day. Thomas tried all of it. Nothing worked. Then came the medications, small pills that promised rest. They made him groggy but didn't actually help him sleep. He'd lie there feeling heavy and drugged but still completely awake, which was somehow worse than before. The doctor increased the dosage, prescribed different medications. Thomas became a walking pharmacy, swallowing pills at bedtime, carrying others in his pocket for those desperate 3 a.m. moments when panic set in. But sleep remained elusive, dancing just out of reach like a cruel joke. His friends stopped inviting him to things. He'd shown up too many times looking like a ghost, barely able to hold a conversation. His sister called every week, her voice tight with worry. "You need to take care of yourself," she'd say. Thomas would promise he was trying, then spend another night watching the clock change from 11 p.m. to midnight to 1 a.m. to 2 a.m., feeling more alone than he'd ever felt in his life. It was a Thursday evening in November when everything changed. Not dramatically at first, just a small moment that would slowly reshape his entire world. Thomas was in his office on campus, surrounded by towers of books and papers that seemed to breathe when he wasn't looking. He was supposed to be working on his dissertation, a project about monastic life in 12th century France that he'd been dragging along for 5 years. His deadline was approaching. His advisor kept sending polite but increasingly concerned emails. He pulled an old book from the shelf, something about daily routines in medieval monasteries. Dry stuff, really. The kind of material that would put most people to sleep, which Thomas found bitterly ironic since it did nothing for him. As he flipped through the pages reading about monks waking at midnight for prayers, he noticed a footnote mentioning Gregorian chants. He'd heard of them before, vaguely. Old church music. Latin words sung by monks. He had a fuzzy memory of his grandmother playing something similar on Sunday mornings when he was a kid. But he'd never paid much attention to it. Out of curiosity more than anything else, he opened his laptop and searched for Gregorian chants. Several recordings came up. He clicked on one at random, something from a French abbey he'd never heard of. The audio started playing through his cheap computer speakers. The sound was immediate and strange. Male voices singing in unison without any instruments, just pure human voice echoing like it was coming from inside a stone cathedral. The melody moved slowly, rising and falling in patterns that felt ancient and somehow familiar at the same time. Latin words he couldn't understand flowed past like a river. Thomas went back to reading his book, the chant playing quietly in the background. He made notes about monastic schedules, highlighted passages about prayer times, tried to force his exhausted brain to focus on the task at hand. But something was happening. He didn't notice it at first. His shoulders, which had been bunched up near his ears for months, slowly began to drop. The tension in his jaw loosened. His breathing, usually shallow and quick, deepened without him trying to make it happen. The voices continued their slow, steady melody. There was something hypnotic about them, not in a weird or scary way, more like being rocked gently by ocean waves. Each phrase of the chant seemed to wash over him, carrying away a little bit of the noise in his head. Thomas stopped reading. He leaned back in his office chair and closed his eyes, just listening. The anxiety that usually clattered around in his chest like loose coins in a dryer began to settle. His thoughts, which normally jumped from worry to worry like a pinball machine, slowed down. He sat there for 20 minutes, maybe longer, just breathing and listening to these ancient voices. When the recording ended, he felt different, calmer, like someone had turned down the volume on everything that had been screaming inside him for years. That night, back in his apartment, Thomas did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He went to bed at a reasonable hour without dreading it. He didn't take his usual pills. He just lay down, plugged in his earphones, and played the same Gregorian chant recording he'd found earlier. The voices filled the darkness of his bedroom. He focused on them, on the slow rise and fall of the melody, on the way the sound seemed to create space around him. His mind tried to wander back to its usual playlist of worries. What if he lost his job? What if he never finished his dissertation? What if he was always going to be this broken version of himself? But the chants kept pulling him back. Not forcefully, gently, like a hand on his shoulder saying, "Not now. Just rest." Thomas didn't expect to fall asleep. He'd learned not to expect it anymore. But somewhere between the Latin words and the patient, timeless voices, his body decided to trust enough to let go. He slept for 6 hours straight. When he woke up, sunlight was coming through his curtains, and he felt something he'd almost forgotten existed. Not happiness exactly, not excitement. Just a simple, quiet feeling that maybe, just maybe, things could be different. He lay there for a long moment, afraid to move, afraid that acknowledging what had happened would break the spell. His body felt rested, actually rested. His mind felt clear, like a window that had been wiped clean after years of accumulated grime. Thomas reached for his phone and looked at the time. 7:30 a.m. He'd gone to bed around midnight. 6.5 hours of uninterrupted sleep. It seemed impossible. Surely he must have woken up at some point. But he had no memory of it. Just darkness and those voices, and then morning. He sat up slowly, almost afraid. Was this real? Or would the insomnia come rushing back tonight, proving that this was just a random fluke, a cruel tease before everything went back to being terrible? Thomas didn't know the answers. But for the first time in 3 years, he felt something close to hope. And it had come from the most unexpected place. Not from medicine or therapy or any of the 100 things he'd tried, but from the voices of monks who'd been dead for centuries, singing prayers in a language he couldn't understand, creating a bridge across time to offer him the one thing he'd been desperately searching for: peace and sleep. And maybe, just maybe, a way forward. Thomas tried to convince himself it was just luck, a random good night after 3 years of terrible ones. His brain, exhausted from fighting sleep for so long, had finally given up for one night. That was all. Nothing mystical or special about some old church music. He went back to his regular routine. The sleeping pills by his bedside. The melatonin gummies he chewed at 9 p.m. like clockwork. The chamomile tea that never worked but made him feel like he was at least trying. He told himself he didn't need the chants. That would be ridiculous. He was a rational person, a scholar, someone who dealt in facts and historical evidence. But by the third night of lying awake until 4 a.m., staring at the same ceiling cracks he'd memorized months ago, Thomas gave in. He pulled out his earphones and found that same recording. The voices filled his ears again, and within an hour he was asleep. This pattern continued for 2 weeks. He'd try to sleep normally, fail miserably, then finally surrender and play the chants. It bothered him that he couldn't explain why they worked. Thomas was someone who liked understanding things. He taught history because he enjoyed finding patterns, tracing cause and effect, making sense of how things connected. So he started researching, not as a professor working on a dissertation, but as someone desperate to understand what was happening to him. He spent his lunch breaks in the library, pulling up medical journals and studies instead of eating. He searched online for any scientific explanation that might make sense of this strange discovery. What he found surprised him. There were actual studies about Gregorian chants and their effects on the human body. Scientists had measured brain waves of people listening to these ancient melodies. They found something interesting. The chants had a unique frequency pattern, different from modern music. The way the notes moved, the spaces between sounds, the rhythm of the Latin words. all created a specific kind of vibration. These vibrations, the study suggested, could slow down brain activity. They moved the brain from its normal alert state into something closer to deep meditation. Heart rates decreased. Breathing patterns changed. The body's stress response quieted down. Thomas read about how monks had developed these chants over centuries, not trying to make beautiful music, but trying to create a doorway to prayer. They weren't performing for an audience. They were using their voices as tools, as bridges between their anxious human minds and something larger and more peaceful. He learned that the chants were designed to match certain breathing patterns. When you listened carefully, your breath naturally began to sync with the rise and fall of the melody. Long, slow inhales during the rising notes, gentle exhales as the sound descended. Without even trying, your body began to breathe the way calm, centered people breathe. There was something else too. The repetitive nature of the chants, the way the same melodies appeared over and over with slight variations, created a kind of safe predictability. Your brain didn't have to work hard to follow along. There were no surprises, no sudden changes, no jarring moments. Just gentle, rolling waves of sound that your mind could rest on. Thomas also discovered that these chants had been sung for over 1,000 years, mostly unchanged. Monks in the 6th century sang the same melodies that monks sang in the 15th century, and that monks still sang today. There was something powerful in that continuity. Like these sounds carried the accumulated peace of centuries, the prayers of millions of people who had also struggled and suffered and searched for rest. But knowing the science didn't change the fact that Thomas still felt embarrassed about needing the chants. He didn't tell anyone. Not his sister, who called weekly to check on him. Not his colleagues at the university. Certainly not his students. What would they think? Their professor, the one who lectured about rational historical analysis, couldn't sleep without medieval monk music. He kept it private, a secret ritual. Every night at 10 o'clock, Thomas would dim the lights in his small apartment. He started lighting a candle, just a simple white one he'd bought at the grocery store. There was no religious meaning to it for him. He just liked having a single point of soft light in the darkness. It made the whole thing feel more intentional, less desperate. He'd lie down, put in his earphones, and press play. The familiar voices would begin their slow procession through Latin prayers he didn't understand, and night after night sleep would come. Not always quickly. Sometimes it took an hour or more. But it came, and that was more than he'd had in 3 years. Slowly, over weeks and then months, Thomas began to notice other changes. The sleep was helping, obviously. He had more energy during the day. His hands stopped shaking. He could focus on his work for longer stretches. But there was something deeper happening too. The anxiety that had lived in his chest like a clenched fist for so long was loosening. Not gone, he wasn't magically cured. But the grip had weakened. He found himself breathing easier during the day. When a stressful thought appeared, like worry about his job or his unfinished dissertation, it didn't immediately spiral into full panic the way it used to. He started noticing moments of quiet in his mind. Little gaps between the constant stream of worried thoughts. Before the chants, his internal dialogue had been like a radio stuck between stations, just constant noise and static. Now there were actual pauses. Moments where he could just exist without narrating or analyzing or worrying about everything. Thomas realized the chants weren't just helping him sleep. They were teaching him something. Every night when he lay down and listened, he was practicing something he'd forgotten how to do. He was practicing letting go, practicing trust, practicing the idea that he didn't have to control everything, that he could surrender and things would be okay. This was hard for him. He'd spent his whole life trying to manage and control things, plan ahead, anticipate problems, stay 3 steps ahead of disaster. It's what made him good at his job, good at research, good at navigating the competitive world of academia. But it also made him terrible at resting. The chants didn't ask anything of him. They didn't require him to be smart or accomplished or worthy. They just were. They'd been sung by monks who probably also struggled with anxiety and doubt and fear. Monks who got up in the middle of the night every night to sing these prayers even when they were tired or sick or discouraged. There was a comfort in that. Thomas wasn't alone in his struggle. He was connected across centuries to other people who had also needed help finding peace. People who had created these sounds as a gift to their future selves and to strangers they'd never meet. 6 months after that first night, Thomas looked at the bottle of sleeping pills on his nightstand. He'd stopped taking them weeks ago but hadn't thrown them away. Some superstitious part of him was afraid that getting rid of them would jinx everything, and the insomnia would come roaring back. But looking at them now, he realized something had shifted. He wasn't the same person who desperately swallowed those pills every night, hoping for just a few hours of peace. He'd found something better, not a drug that forced his body to shut down, but a practice that invited him to rest. There was a huge difference between those two things. Thomas picked up the bottle and walked to his bathroom. He stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of it in his hand. Then he poured the pills down the toilet and threw the empty bottle in the trash. He didn't know if the chants would work forever. Maybe one day they'd stop helping, and he'd have to find something else. But for now, for this moment, he had something precious. He had sleep. He had peace. He had a small ritual that made him feel connected to something larger than his own anxiety. And more than that, he had hope. Real hope. The kind that comes not from wishful thinking, but from actual evidence that things can change, that healing is possible, that even the deepest struggles don't have to be permanent. That night, Thomas lit his candle at exactly 10 o'clock. He lay down in the familiar darkness of his bedroom. The voices began to sing, timeless and patient, and he felt himself begin to drift. Somewhere between waking and sleeping, between struggle and surrender, he found the peace he'd been searching for all along. It had been there the whole time, hidden in songs that were older than any of his problems, waiting for him to stop fighting long enough to listen. Thomas was grading papers on a Tuesday afternoon when he made a decision that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. He was going to France, not for a conference or a research trip in the usual academic sense. He was going to the place where his recording had been made, the Abbey of Saint-Pierre de Solesmes, a monastery in the French countryside where monks still sang these ancient chants every single day. The idea had been growing in his mind for weeks. He'd been sleeping better, feeling more balanced, but something inside him wanted to understand this more deeply. He wanted to experience the chants in the place they were meant to be heard. Not through cheap earphones in a dark apartment, but in the stone halls where monks had been singing them for centuries. He applied for a sabbatical from the university. 3 months away from teaching to work on his dissertation. His department had approved it easily. Thomas had been at the university for 12 years and had never taken extended time off. Everyone agreed he'd earned it. But Thomas knew the real reason he was going had little to do with his dissertation. He was going because something was calling him there. He couldn't explain it in rational terms, and he'd stopped trying. Some things he was learning didn't need to be explained or justified. They just needed to be followed. The flight to Paris, then the train ride south, then the taxi through small French villages felt like traveling backward in time. The modern world slowly peeled away with each mile. When the taxi finally pulled up to the Abbey, Thomas sat in the back seat for a long moment, just staring. The building was ancient, made of pale stone that glowed in the late afternoon sun. It looked exactly like something from his history books. Arched windows, a bell tower, walls that had stood for hundreds of years. He could hear birds singing and wind moving through trees. No car sounds, no sirens, just quiet. A monk met him at the entrance. Brother Etienne was probably in his 70s with white hair and kind eyes that had deep wrinkles at the corners. He spoke English with a heavy French accent, welcoming Thomas warmly but without excessive fuss. The monks, Thomas would learn, didn't waste words. They lived in silence most of the day, speaking only when necessary. His room was small and simple. A narrow bed, a wooden desk, a chair, a crucifix on the wall. One window looked out over gardens where other monks were working, pulling weeds and tending to vegetables. The simplicity was startling. Thomas thought about his apartment back home, cluttered with books and papers and all the accumulated stuff of modern life. This room had almost nothing, and somehow it felt more peaceful than anywhere he'd ever been. Brother Etienne explained the schedule. The monks woke at 4 a.m. for vigils, the first prayer service of the day. Then came lauds at dawn, mass in the morning, prayers scattered throughout the day, and finally compline at night before sleep. The whole day was structured around these moments of coming together to sing. Thomas was welcome to join any or all of these services. No pressure, Brother Etienne said. Some visitors came to all of them. Some came to none and just enjoyed the quiet. Everyone found their own way. That first night, Thomas set his alarm for 3:45 a.m. He'd come all this way. He wanted to experience what the monks experienced. When the alarm went off in the pitch dark, his body protested, but he forced himself up, dressed in the dim light, and made his way through the silent corridors toward the chapel. He wasn't prepared for what he found there. The chapel was completely dark except for a few small candles. Monks filed in silently, taking their places in wooden choir stalls that faced each other across the center aisle. Thomas sat in a pew in the back, trying to make himself invisible. Then the singing began. Not from a recording, not through speakers or earphones, but live right there, human voices rising in the darkness. The sound was overwhelming. It filled the stone space, echoed off ancient walls, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Thomas felt tears on his face before he realized he was crying. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was exhaustion from waking so early. Maybe it was the beauty of the moment. Maybe it was relief or gratitude or something he didn't have words for. He just sat there in the dark, listening to these men sing prayers that had been sung in this exact place for generations, and let himself cry quietly. The service lasted about 45 minutes. When it ended, the monks filed out as silently as they'd entered. Thomas sat alone for a while longer, not ready to leave. The space felt sacred in a way he'd never experienced before. Not because of religion necessarily, though that was part of it, but because of the dedication. These men got up every single day at 4 a.m. to do this, in summer and winter. When they felt like it and when they didn't, they showed up and sang, creating beauty and prayer whether anyone was listening or not. Over the following days and weeks, Thomas fell into the rhythm of monastery life. He started waking for vigils every morning. The 4 a.m. wake-up got easier after the first week. His body adjusted, began to crave that quiet time in the dark chapel. He attended most of the other services too, though he sometimes skipped the midday prayers to walk in the gardens or sit in his room reading. Brother Etienne checked on him occasionally. The old monk had lived at the abbey for 60 years since he was a young man. Thomas asked him once why he'd chosen this life. Brother Etienne smiled and said it wasn't really a choice in the way most people thought of choices. It was more like recognizing where he belonged and having the courage to actually go there. They talked sometimes after the evening prayer service, short conversations in the cloisters as darkness fell. Brother Etienne asked about Thomas's life, his struggles with sleep, what had brought him to the monastery. Thomas found himself being more honest than he'd been with anyone in years. Maybe it was easier to be honest with someone who lived outside the normal world, someone who wouldn't judge him by the usual standards. One evening, Thomas confessed that he felt embarrassed about needing the chance to sleep, like it was a weakness, a crutch he should be able to do without. Brother Etienne looked at him with those kind, wrinkled eyes and said something Thomas would never forget. "The chants are not meant to be beautiful," the old monk said quietly. "They are meant to be true. They carry the prayers of centuries, the sorrows and hopes of every soul who has ever felt lost. When you listen to them, you are not alone. You are joining a conversation that has been happening for 1,000 years. People before you could not sleep. People before you felt anxious and afraid. They created these songs to help themselves and to help you, though they did not know your name." Thomas thought about that for days. He'd been so focused on why the chants worked, the science behind them, the frequencies and brainwaves and measurable effects. But maybe the real answer was simpler and deeper than that. Maybe the chants worked because they connected him to everyone who had ever struggled the way he struggled, because they reminded him that suffering wasn't new, and neither was healing. He watched the monks carefully during his time there. They weren't perfect. They got tired. He saw them yawn during morning prayers, saw them struggle to stay focused during long services. They were human beings with all the normal human problems, but they'd found a structure, a practice, a way of living that held them even when they felt weak. The chants weren't magic. The monastery wasn't paradise, but there was something profound about choosing, every single day, to show up and sing, to create beauty in prayer not because you felt inspired, but because it was time to do it, to trust that the practice itself was enough, even when you couldn't feel any immediate results. Thomas realized this was what he'd been missing in his own life. He'd been waiting to feel better before he could function normally, waiting for the anxiety to go away before he could relax, waiting to solve all his problems before he could rest. But the monks taught him something different. You don't wait to feel peaceful before you practice peace. You practice peace and eventually, slowly, it becomes real. On his last morning at the Abbey, Thomas woke for vigils one final time. He sat in his usual spot in the dark chapel, listening to the familiar voices sing the familiar prayers. But this time he understood what he was hearing. Not the Latin words, he still didn't know what those meant, but the deeper message underneath. The message that said, "You are not alone. You are held. You can rest now." When he left the next day, Brother Etienne walked him to the gate. The old monk hugged him, which surprised Thomas because the monks were usually so reserved. "Take the silence with you," Brother Etienne said. "It is not only here, it is everywhere underneath all the noise. You know how to find it now?" Thomas boarded his train with tears in his eyes again, but this time they weren't tears of pain or overwhelm. They were tears of gratitude. He'd come to France looking for answers and found something better. He'd found a way of being in the world that didn't require him to be perfect or fixed or free of struggle. He'd found permission to be human. When Thomas returned to campus that fall, people noticed something different about him. He couldn't quite name what had changed, but it was there, in the way he walked through the halls, in how he held himself during faculty meetings, even in how he greeted the security guard at the building entrance each morning. His sister noticed it first during their weekly phone call. "You sound different," she said, a smile in her voice. Lighter somehow. "What happened over there?" Thomas tried to explain, but the words felt inadequate. How do you tell someone that sitting in a dark chapel at 4 a.m. with monks you barely spoke to somehow rearranged your entire understanding of life? How do you explain that silence can be louder than noise? That emptiness can feel more full than abundance? "I learned to rest," he finally said. Which was true, but only part of the truth. His colleagues were more direct. "You look like you actually slept," one professor said in the break room. "What's your secret? New medication?" Thomas smiled and shook his head. "Just some old music," he said, leaving it at that. But the real change showed up in his teaching. His students noticed it immediately. The professor who had seemed perpetually exhausted and distracted was suddenly present. Actually present. He made eye contact during lectures. He remembered their names. When they came to his office hours with questions, he listened fully instead of glancing at his computer screen every few seconds. One afternoon, a student named Alex stayed after class. A junior pre-med track. The kind of kid who carried anxiety like a backpack loaded with stones. Alex had been coming to Thomas's medieval history class all semester, but rarely spoke. Today, though, he waited until everyone else left. "Professor?" Alex's voice was quiet. "Can I ask you something kind of personal?" Thomas nodded, gesturing to a chair. "Of course. You seem really different this semester. Calmer, I guess. And I was wondering—" Alex paused, looking embarrassed. "I've been having trouble sleeping." "Really bad trouble? And I heard you playing some kind of music before class one day. Through your office door. It sounded like church music or something." Thomas felt something shift inside him. For months he'd kept his discovery private, almost secretive. But looking at this exhausted kid in front of him, he suddenly understood why he'd been given this gift. Not just for himself. For moments exactly like this one. Gregorian chants, Thomas said. "That's what you heard. Music sung by monks. And yes, they helped me sleep after years of insomnia." Alex's eyes widened. "Really? You had insomnia too?" "For 3 years. Couldn't sleep more than an hour or two a night. Tried everything. The chants were the only thing that worked. They talked for over an hour. Thomas told him about the recordings, about the monastery, about the 4 a.m. prayer services in the dark. He didn't preach or promise miracles. He just shared his experience honestly. Alex listened like someone dying of thirst who'd just found water. Could you maybe play some of that music for me sometime?" Alex asked as he was leaving. "I'm desperate. I have exams coming up and I can barely function." Thomas thought for a moment. "Tell you what. Come back Thursday evening, around 7 p.m. I'll play some for you properly." Alex showed up that Thursday with another student, a girl from the women's soccer team who looked like she hadn't slept in weeks. Then word spread the way things spread on college campuses, through text messages and whispered conversations between classes. The next week, 5 students showed up. The week after that, 11. Thomas moved the gathering from his cramped office to a small classroom. He didn't lecture. He didn't try to convert anyone to anything. He just played the chants, explaining a little about their history and why they seemed to help. Then he let people sit in silence and listen. Some students brought homework and worked quietly. Others just sat with their eyes closed. A few fell asleep right there in their chairs, and Thomas let them. When it was over, after about 45 minutes, people left quietly. Nobody felt the need to fill the silence with chatter. One student, a soccer player named Riley, told Thomas she'd been averaging 3 hours of sleep a night during competition season. Her coach was worried. Her grades were dropping. "That meditation stuff never worked for me," she said. "Too much pressure to clear your mind or whatever. But this is different. I can just listen. I don't have to do anything." A graduate student in engineering started coming. Then a kid from the debate team. Then someone from the campus newspaper who wrote an article about it with the headline, "Medieval Music Helps Modern Students Sleep." Thomas cringed at the headline, but the article was thoughtful and honest. More people showed up. The sessions got a name, though Thomas never officially named them. Students started calling it night prayer or just compline, the term for the last prayer service monks sang before bed. Some people came every week. Others showed up only during finals when the stress became unbearable. Thomas made one rule: no phones during the session. Not even silent ones. Everything had to be put away. Some students struggled with this at first, itching for their devices like addicts, but gradually, they learned to sit with just themselves and the music, and something in them began to settle. A basketball player told Thomas the chants helped before big games. A theater major said she listened before auditions. A kid studying computer science started playing them while coding late at night and found he could focus better. The chants were spreading through campus like a gentle virus, infecting people with peace. The campus counseling center heard about what was happening. A therapist named Dr. Kim reached out to Thomas. "We're seeing a lot of students with anxiety and sleep issues," she said. "More every year. Would you be willing to talk to our staff about what you're doing?" Thomas gave a presentation to the counseling team. He brought research studies about frequency patterns and stress reduction. But he also talked about the human side, about feeling lost and desperate, about finding unexpected help from voices centuries old, about learning to surrender instead of fight. Dr. Kim started recommending the chants to certain students, not as a replacement for therapy or medication when those were needed, but as an additional tool, something students could use on their own, in their dorm rooms at 2 a.m. when panic hit and no counselor was available. One evening, Thomas was locking up the classroom after a session when a student he didn't recognize approached him. The kid looked like he'd been through hell. Dark circles under his eyes, hands shaking slightly, the telltale signs of someone barely holding it together. "I need to talk to you," the student said. His name was Chris, a sophomore. "I'm not doing well. Haven't been for a while, and I heard about these meetings, but I was too embarrassed to come. But tonight I need help. I'm really not okay." Thomas sat with him for 2 hours. He listened to Chris talk about depression, about suicidal thoughts he'd been having, about feeling completely alone despite being surrounded by thousands of students. Thomas didn't try to fix him or give easy answers. He just listened, and then he played the chants on his laptop quietly while they sat together in that empty classroom. "These won't solve everything," Thomas said gently. "You need real help. Professional help. But they might give you a little bit of peace while you're getting that help. A little bit of space to breathe." Chris started crying. Not dramatic sobs, just quiet tears rolling down his face. "I'm just so tired," he whispered. "I'm so tired of fighting my own brain all the time." "I know," Thomas said. "I really know." They sat there until almost midnight, two people who'd been strangers an hour earlier, connected by shared suffering and ancient music. Before Chris left, Thomas walked him to the counseling center's after-hours crisis line number and made him promise to call. Chris nodded, still crying, but something in his eyes looked a little less desperate than when he'd arrived. Thomas went home that night feeling shaken, but also purposeful. This thing that had started as his own private solution to insomnia had somehow become bigger. It had become a gift he could give to others who were struggling the way he'd struggled. He thought about Brother Etienne's words, about how the chants carried the prayers of everyone who'd ever felt lost. He was seeing that now every week in the faces of these students who showed up looking exhausted and left looking a little more at peace. His own dissertation sat unfinished on his desk. His academic career hadn't magically transformed. He still had the same small apartment, the same modest salary, the same basic life challenges. But none of that felt as important anymore. What felt important was the way Riley had told him she'd slept 6 hours straight for the first time in months. The way Alex's mom had sent him a thank you email saying her son seemed like himself again. The way Chris had texted him a week later saying he'd started therapy and was feeling a tiny bit more hopeful. Thomas looked at the recording on his laptop, the same one he'd stumbled across 2 years ago while researching medieval monasteries. Such a small thing, such a random discovery, but it had changed everything. Not just for him, but for dozens of students who'd found their way to those Thursday evening sessions. He put in his earphones and pressed play, the familiar voices washing over him. Outside his window, the campus was settling into sleep. In dorm rooms across the university, students were lying in their beds, some of them listening to these same chants, finding the same peace he'd found. Thomas smiled and closed his eyes. He'd come to France looking for answers and found them. But he'd found something even better. He'd found a way to take what had saved him and offer it to others who needed saving. And in doing that, he'd discovered the real purpose of his own healing. It wasn't just about him learning to sleep. It was about him learning to help others rest too. 3 years had passed since that November evening when Thomas first heard Gregorian chants in his cluttered office. 3 years since he'd slept 6 uninterrupted hours for the first time in what felt like forever. Looking back now, it seemed like a different lifetime. Like that exhausted, desperate version of himself was someone he used to know but barely recognized anymore. The Thursday evening sessions had become a fixture on campus. Students called it Compline, and it had moved from a small classroom to the university chapel, a beautiful old building that sat unused most of the time. The administration had been happy to let Thomas use it. Anything that helped students cope with stress was welcome in their eyes. On average, about 40 students showed up each week. Some were regulars who never missed a session. Others came and went depending on their stress levels. During finals week, the chapel would be packed with over 100 people, all sitting in silence, listening to voices from centuries ago offer them a moment of peace. Thomas still didn't lecture or preach. He'd say a few words at the beginning, welcoming people, maybe sharing a thought about rest or letting go. Then he'd play the chants through the chapel's sound system and everyone would just sit. Some people closed their eyes. Some stared at the stained glass windows. Some just looked at their hands. It didn't matter. There was no right way to do it. One spring evening, Thomas received an email that would change things again. It was from a woman named Dr. Patricia Chen. She worked at a veterans hospital in California and had heard about the Compline sessions from a former student who'd graduated and joined the military. The email explained that the hospital was struggling to help veterans with severe PTSD and insomnia. Traditional treatments helped some, but others remained trapped in cycles of sleeplessness and anxiety. Dr. Chen had done some research on Gregorian chants and wondered if Thomas would be willing to consult on a program they were developing. Thomas read the email 3 times. Veterans, people who'd experienced trauma he couldn't even imagine. Who was he to help with that? He was just a history professor who'd stumbled onto something that worked for his own insomnia. But then he remembered Chris, the student who'd come to him desperate and suicidal. He remembered Riley, the soccer player who'd been running on 3 hours of sleep. He remembered his own darkest nights lying awake, feeling completely alone. Maybe that's exactly why he should help. Because he understood what it felt like to be desperate. He replied to Dr. Chen, and within a month, he was on a plane to San Diego. The Veterans Hospital was larger than he expected, a sprawling complex where people with visible and invisible wounds came for treatment. Dr. Chen met him at the entrance, a warm woman in her 50s who shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for coming," she said. "We've tried music therapy before, but nothing quite like this. The research on Gregorian chants is fascinating." She introduced him to her team: psychologists, sleep specialists, trauma, the rapists. They'd been working with veterans for years and knew the statistics. How many struggled to sleep? How many couldn't turn off their minds long enough to rest? How many lived in constant states of hypervigilance, unable to let their guard down even in safe places? Thomas spent a week training staff members on how to use the chants, not as background music but as a practice, as something intentional and sacred. He taught them what he'd learned from Brother Etienne, that the chants weren't about being beautiful, they were about being true, about creating a space where suffering people could rest. The pilot program started with 12 veterans. Thomas sat in on the first session, nervous in a way he hadn't been since his first day teaching. These were men and women who'd seen combat, who'd lost friends, who carried memories that woke them screaming in the night. What could medieval music possibly do for them? But as the chants filled the room, Thomas watched something happen. Shoulders that had been tight with tension slowly dropped. Breathing that had been quick and shallow began to deepen. Faces that had looked hard and closed began to soften just slightly. One veteran, a man named David who'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, stayed after everyone else left. He was in his early 30s but looked older, with tired eyes that seemed to look past everything. "Can I ask you something?" David said quietly. "Why does this work?" Thomas thought for a long moment. "I think it's because these chants are old. Really old. They've been sung through wars and plagues and all kinds of darkness. When you listen to them, you're connecting with everyone who ever needed comfort. You're not alone in what you're feeling. People have survived this kind of pain before, and they left these songs behind to help the next person who needed them." David nodded slowly, his eyes wet. "I haven't told anyone this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But your chants are the only thing that stands between me and—" He trailed off, but Thomas understood. "Between you and giving up." Thomas finished gently. "Yeah." David wiped his eyes. "When those voices sing, it's like someone's telling me it's okay to stop fighting for a minute. That I can rest. I haven't felt safe enough to rest in years." Thomas felt his own throat tighten. This is why he'd come. Not for research or recognition. For this moment right here. For this one person who needed to hear that rest was possible, that peace existed, that he didn't have to carry everything alone. Over the next year, the program expanded. Other hospitals heard about it and wanted to try similar approaches. Sleep clinics started studying the effects of Gregorian chants on different types of insomnia. Meditation apps reached out, asking if they could feature authentic monastery recordings. Thomas found himself on the phone with therapists across the country, sharing what he'd learned. Not as an expert, but as someone who'd been in the darkness and found a light. He always made sure to tell his own story. The pills that hadn't worked, the desperate nights, the random discovery that changed everything. The letters started coming. Handwritten notes from people he'd never met. A teacher in Ohio who'd been suffering from anxiety for years. A nurse in Seattle who worked night shifts and couldn't sleep during the day. A retired firefighter in Florida dealing with PTSD. All of them had found the chants somehow, through the apps or the hospital programs or word of mouth, and all of them wanted to say thank you. Thomas kept every letter in a box under his bed. On difficult days, when he felt tired or wondered if any of this mattered, he'd read through them. Reminders that healing ripples outward in ways you can never predict. His own life had settled into something approaching contentment. He'd finally finished his dissertation, though it no longer felt like the most important thing he'd ever do. He still taught his medieval history classes. He still held the Thursday evening compline sessions. He still lit a candle every night at 10 o'clock and listened to the chants before sleep, but he'd also learned to be gentle with himself. Some nights the chants worked perfectly and sleep came easy. Other nights were harder, and that was okay too. Healing wasn't linear. Peace wasn't permanent. It was something you practiced over and over, until it became part of who you were. One evening, Thomas received a package from France. Inside was a letter from Brother Etienne, written in careful English. The old monk was in his 80s now, and wrote to say he'd heard about Thomas's work with students and veterans. He'd heard about the program spreading across the country. "You have done what we all hoped to do," Brother Etienne wrote. "You have taken your suffering and transformed it into service. You have taken your healing and offered it to others. This is the true meaning of our chants. They are not meant to be kept. They are meant to be shared, like light from one candle lighting another, until the darkness is filled with small flames." Thomas read the letter sitting in his office, the same office where this whole journey had begun. He looked at the shelf where he'd pulled that book about medieval monasteries all those years ago. Such a small moment. Such an unlikely chain of events. He thought about David at the Veterans Hospital, about Chris who'd been suicidal, about Riley who couldn't sleep, about the hundreds of students who'd passed through the Thursday sessions. He thought about all the people he'd never meet who were listening to these same chants tonight, in their own dark rooms, searching for the same peace he'd once desperately needed. And he realized something profound. His insomnia, those 3 terrible years of sleeplessness that had nearly broken him, hadn't been meaningless suffering. It had been preparation. It had taught him empathy. It had made him humble. It had shown him that sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the darkest struggles. Thomas pulled out his phone and typed a message to David. "How are you doing tonight?" The response came quickly. "Listening to the chants, breathing, still here." "Thank you for that." Thomas smiled, his eyes filling with tears. "Thank you for still being here," he typed back. "The world needs you." He turned off his office lights and walked out into the cool evening air. Across campus, students were heading to the library, to dinner, to their dorms. Some of them would sleep easily tonight. Others would struggle. Some would remember the chants and play them. Others would find different paths to peace. But somewhere in the darkness, ancient voices were singing. They'd been singing for 1,000 years and would sing for 1,000 more, carrying prayers and sorrows and hopes across time, reminding anyone who listened that they were not alone, that people had survived before them, that rest was possible, that healing was real. Thomas walked home slowly, already looking forward to his own nightly ritual. The candle. The darkness. The familiar voices. The gentle drift into sleep. He'd started this journey desperate and broken, searching for a way to survive. But he'd found something better than survival. He'd found purpose. He'd found connection. He'd found a way to take his own pain and use it to ease the pain of others. And in doing that, he'd discovered the greatest peace of all. Not the absence of struggle, but the knowledge that struggle can be transformed into something beautiful. That even our darkest nights can become doorways to light for someone else who's lost in the darkness. The chants had saved him, and now through him they were saving others. One person at a time, one quiet evening at a time, one moment of rest at a time, and that was enough. More than enough. It was everything.